Thanks, Doug, for that kind introduction and for the invite to Vanderbilt today. It's great to be here. It's great to be the inaugural speaker. Sorry, we have two microphones here, so I have to turn those down. We're getting a little feedback? Okay.
Are you testing technology?
Well, they're also recording us too, so that's the issue. For some reason, you have to wear two microphones when they're recording you. So anyway, it's great to be here. Sorry. Okay, now we're going to try it. Okay, it's great to be here. It's also great to be part of the inaugural speaker in this speaker series. Either people like me will follow me, or others won't. But before we begin, I'd like to make some disclosures before I speak, especially to academic audiences. First, I am not an academic. I have never taught full-time or worked full-time on a college campus. I come from a world of journalism. I've been a reporter and columnist covering higher education for nearly 20 years. And I always say that, particularly when I'm on college campuses. A couple of years ago, I was speaking at the University of Kentucky, and at the end of the talk, a faculty member in the back raised her hand, and she wanted to know about my research methods for my book. And I told her, in journalism, if you have 3 anecdotes, you have a trend. So if you ever want to know how the New York Times writes those great front page stories about the latest trend in whatever, it's usually because they found their brother, their cousin, and some neighbor on the street to write that. So first of all, I come from a journalism background, much more of a qualitative researcher. I go out, I interview the experts. I interview students and parents, which I did for this book, and then I tried to explain that to a lay audience. So that's number one. I've approached this from a journalism angle. Secondly, after working for the Chronicle of Higher Education for 16 years, when I decided to write this book, I decided to turn the lens on higher education. So after kind of covering higher education from the inside for that many years, as many of you may know, the Chronicle is to higher education very much like the Wall Street Journal is to the finance world. I decided to see what higher education, what folks thought of higher education from the outside, and decided, as you'll see from my talk today, to really kind of explore higher education from a different perspective than I have for most of my career. And if you've read College Unbound, you will see, especially from the first couple of chapters, that I'm pretty critical of where higher education has come to this point where we are today, which I think is in somewhat of a crisis. And then number three, I'm glad again to speak on college campuses, and I'm glad that people in higher education have read College Unbound and are interested in it. But I really did write this for students and parents because one thing I noticed in talking to students and parents throughout the process of reporting this book is I discovered institutions know so much more about the students who are applying to their institutions than even in this world that we have of so much information today, than those students know about the institutions they might be spending the next 4 years of their lives at, and of course spending a lot of money to attend. And so I think it's pretty critical that parents and students are better armed with information about higher education in general, but particular institutions as well. So my hope today is to really talk kind of at a 50,000-foot level about where I think higher education has been, how we got to the point we are today. And then I want to lay out various visions of where we could be going in the future. Technology, I think, is a big piece of that. But one of the things I want to talk today is about how I think traditional colleges and universities, residential campuses in particular, can compete in this new world. So many times I'm asked about how I got my start in higher education reporting. And so 21 years ago now, I interned at U.S. News and World Report on their college guide. I worked along with 8 other college students on the annual college rankings. So if you ever want to know exactly how those college rankings are put together, I could kind of give you the full story. But when I was cleaning out my office recently, I found the 1989 U.S. News and World Report rankings. So this was the first year U.S. News and World Report did annual rankings. So up to this point, they used to do them every other year. But this was it. This is all they did back in the late 1980s. They only ranked the top 25 national universities. And you'll notice a couple of things from looking at this list. When I found this in my office at the Chronicle and I was showing it to some of my colleagues, of course, they went right to that right-hand column. And they said, wow, Stanford was a great deal back then, back in 1989 when tuition was less than $12,000 a year. One of the things I noticed was how many public universities were on this list back in 1989 compared to today, when there are only 3 in the top 25 of national universities. And largely that's because of the input measures that U.S. News and World Report has added over the years. So back here in 1989, they based these entire rankings on one number, that rating, which was a peer rating of presidents and admissions deans at the time, where they sent out a peer assessment, and that's how they based those rankings. And as many of you know in this room who have followed the rankings over the years, over time they've added a number of input measures to that, so that the peer ranking now counts for a lot, but a lot less than it did back in the late 1980s. And so now it's about the strength of the students coming in the door, the amount you spend on faculty, the amount of money you raise, and so forth. And over time, that has really helped private institutions in particular that are able to spend a lot more money on many of those measures. But the other thing that the U.S. News and World Report rankings did, especially beginning in the early 1990s, was set off this worldwide race around rankings. And now almost a week can't go by where there's yet another rankings by a magazine in the US or some other worldwide rankings. And really, in my mind, this period of 1990s and the early 2000s really set off this prestige race in higher education, where every institution wanted to be like an institution 1 or 2 rungs up the ladder. Because in the race in higher education, it was really about Harvard envy, right? It was really about becoming more like Harvard or more like Vanderbilt for those institutions further down the rankings, or more like some other institution. And what I think this did really, and this is, I think, a big part of the story about where we are in higher ed, is that it's not that I don't think that institutions are innovative, higher education institutions are innovative, but most of that innovation is actually happening around the fringes, right? It's happening within a particular department or in a particular school. It's always interesting when I go to campuses and presidents and others want to take me around to show me the most innovative things happening on their campuses. It's always stuck in some corner of campus. It's never at the academic core. And when I inquire about that, it always comes back to this. It always comes back to, well, we don't want to be different than the institutions we're competing against today or the institutions that we want to be tomorrow. But the fact of the matter is, I think that this race, which I think now is largely over and has been a fool's errand for much of the last 20 years, because the fact of the matter is that the admissions pool in American higher education has been changing drastically over the last 50 years. So work by Carolyn Hawksby, who's an economist at Stanford University, has found that the idea of going to college has changed in the last 50 years, largely because of technology, the ease of technology now to communicate, and the ease of travel around the world. And so it used to be that smart students went to schools within 50 miles, right? Now they have the whole world to choose from. And as a result, half of colleges have actually become less selective over the last 50 years. So for all these stories you see in the New York Times right around this time of year about how difficult it is to get into college, right? About how places like Stanford and Harvard and Yale now have acceptance rates that are in the low single digits in some cases. This is not the case for the majority of American higher education. And in fact, in the last couple of years, half of American colleges and universities have either missed their enrollment goal of filling seats, or they missed their revenue goal. They had to discount tuition too much in order to fill the seats they had. And as a result, what you end up seeing are predictions like this. This is Clay Christensen, the infamous, I guess, Harvard Business School professor who has projected that in the next 10 to 15 years, the bottom 25% of all American colleges and universities will either disappear or merge. Now, I don't necessarily believe this, and when people invite me to campuses, they think this is what I'm going to talk about, right? They think about how, they think I'm going to say, well, you know, the residential campus is over, right? Institutions, residential institutions are going to go out of business. I don't believe that. We're all going to go online, fully online, and if you look at any survey of 18 to 22-year-olds anywhere around the world, they don't want to go to school fully online, but that doesn't mean they don't want technology at all as part of their education. And then finally, they think, well, he's going to talk about how really the purpose of college today is to get a job and that the liberal arts are dead. And in fact, if you read College Unbound, I write a whole chapter that talks about how in today's day and age and in today's economy, the liberal arts are more important than ever, given the massive changes in the economy and how careers and jobs are changing drastically. But that doesn't mean that higher education is not going to undergo massive change in the next 10 or 15 years. I mean, just think about what it was like to be in the boardroom of any of these companies when massive change kind of enveloped them overnight, and they really didn't know what was coming, right? So what it was like to be at Blockbuster when Netflix came along, right? Or Borders when Amazon came along, or Tower Records, which probably some of you in this room don't even know about, don't even know existed, when iTunes came along, or now to be at Apple when they have to go out and buy Beats music because people are not downloading music anymore, they're streaming music, right? So this change is happening constantly in all of these other sectors of the economy, change that I think is going to come to higher ed. I saw this in my own industry about 20 years ago, soon after I entered it, when I would go to conferences and sit in rooms very much like this in the late 1990s, and somebody would be up in the front of the room talking about how change was going to come to the newspaper industry, to the publishing industry, and everybody would be shaking their heads, right? Never going to happen, right? We were a public trust, right? And everybody thought people would always want a newspaper delivered to their front door, right? We were the best in the world, and we didn't really quite believe, even when faced with the facts, because in many ways I think that journalists and faculty members are cut from the same cloth. We're very cynical about the world around us. We didn't want to believe, even when presented with many of the facts, that the world was going to change around us. In many ways, I see what's happening to higher education now very similar to this world that I lived in the late 1990s, and I think you all know what has happened to publishing over this last decade. And I think that this change is about to come to higher education, and it's largely because of the students, and it's largely going to be driven by the students who are in the system now and about to come into the system. So this is how, for the most of the history of higher education, we have viewed students in college, right? They're either traditional students, 18 to 22-year-olds, right? Most of the people here on Vanderbilt's campus, right? They serve a traditional student body, or non-traditional, kind of everybody else. And if you know anything about the demographics, you know the non-traditional students actually make up a much larger proportion of college students today than the traditional students. But we really thought of them in these two ways, right? We didn't think of them in the reasons for why they decided to come to college, what they want to get out of college. And this is where I think the change is going to come in higher ed over the next decade. So the work that I think is more interesting that Clay Christensen has done over the last 10 years is his theory on the jobs to be done, right? And this idea of why customers come to a business, or why customers come to a certain industry to get a job that they need to have done. And those jobs are not based on demographics, as we have largely segmented students in higher education, but largely on what students want to have, what they want to achieve in higher education. So last year, I worked with a group out of Boston called the Parthenon Group, and we wanted to know what motivates students to go to college, undergraduates, right? What do they want to get out of their bachelor's degree experience? So we surveyed, and then did follow-up interviews with some of them. We surveyed 3,000 students who were either getting their bachelor's degree or about to get their bachelor's degree, right? Or about to go to college. And we asked them a series of questions about what was motivating them to go to college. And then we segmented them in different ways. And what we found was actually, instead of 2 groups of students, there are actually 6 groups, big buckets of students. And in some cases, there may be more. And these buckets actually exist at many different colleges. And many of them exist and are not being well served by most institutions. And so there are these 3 groups, which I think of as a part of the traditional bucket that we think of in higher education, right? So there's the young academics, right? These are the students that most colleges want, right? They are very serious students. They're in the top 10% of their high school graduating class. They typically come from upper middle income families or upper income families. They're very serious about their studies. They probably want to go on to graduate or professional school afterwards, right? Then there's the coming of age student, right? The student who sees college as a rite of passage, a place they're not quite sure of what they want to get out of their career. But they see it as a place that they have to go to for 4 years to mature. And then there are the career starters, and increasingly we're seeing more and more of these at the 18-year-old level who see college as a means to an end, right? A means to a job. We want to get in and get out as fast as possible. Now, all of these students are of the same age, right? And we tend to treat them in very much the same way on many of our campuses, although their goals for higher education are very different. In some ways, some of these students at the age of 18 actually have more in common with many more of the adult students that we found who were going for their bachelor's degrees, right? So the career accelerators, these are adult students who are already in a career, right, and want to get ahead in it, and actually have a lot in common with those career starters, even at the age of 18, who see college as a means to an end. And then there's the industry switchers. We see a lot of these in my old industry of journalism, right, who are now out of a job. So many of these people are unemployed or about to be unemployed and have to go back to school to switch into a new industry. And then there are what we call the adult wanderers, right? Those are folks who know they need to get a degree, but are not quite sure why, except that they know that, or what they want to get that degree in, but they know that they need to get a piece of paper to signal to the job market that they are ready. And so what we did was we sized these different markets of students. And as you'll see, the young academics, that 24%, the largest of the group, right? But there's a lot more of these other students combined. And what's happening is when I was editor of the Chronicle and I would have presidents come through my office and talk about the segments of students that they're after, they're always going after that blue group, right? And there's simply not enough of them to go around to sustain the hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of institutions going after them, which is why we see every fall a number of institutions falling short of their enrollment goals or falling short of their revenue goals because they're continuing to go after a small segment of students that now have many more choices, according to the Hawksby research, of institutions around the world. So we tend to talk about student debt a lot in this country, right? You can't go, there's not a day that goes by where you can't read another story about a student who's heavily in debt. We rarely talk about this number, right? This is the amount of debt now held by colleges and universities across the country, which, as you can see, has almost doubled just since 2001. Now, debt is not a problem, right? We all have it in our lives. Buy cars, we buy houses, right? But we all do that under the assumption that we're going to continue to bring in revenue, right? We're going to continue to have a job that brings in a salary, and hopefully over time we'll actually get a raise and we'll bring in more money. Well, part of the problem now is that 75%, 3/4 of American colleges and universities have either flat or declining net tuition revenue. That's the cash on hand they have after they give out money for financial aid. That's money that they have to invest in new programs and new faculty and eventually in new debt and new buildings and so forth. 75%, according to Moody's, have either flat or declining net tuition revenue. I was talking to a chief financial officer of a private college recently, a mid-sized private college, who told me that their net tuition revenue is the same today as it was in 2008. 2008, even though their tuition has been going up 4% a year. If you've been following the news, this is the exact problem that Sweetbriar College in Virginia got into, right? Where they kept raising their tuition, but along with that, they also had to continue raising the discount they were offering to everybody, and at the end of the day, they had less and less cash to actually do things with, including investing in new programs. Even if colleges or universities were able to figure this problem out, even if they were able to get out of this death spiral that many of them are in around pricing, they're going to face a bigger problem, a macroeconomic problem that is somewhat out of their control. So this looks at how much the average family, the median family in the U.S. Has paid in terms of average tuition across the U.S. So this is how much a four-year average college tuition in the U.S. eats up as part of the family paycheck in the U.S. And this is sticker price. So obviously most parents are not necessarily paying sticker price, but this gives you kind of an indication of what's happening across the country. So back in 2001, it cost the median family in the U.S. less than 25% of their earnings to pay for 4 years of college. Today, that number is over 40%. Now, it's not all of college's fault, right? In fact, in the last couple of years, we've seen tuition moderate at many places. The problem is those numbers at the bottom, where we have basically flat and declining median income in the U.S. This is the macroeconomic problem. So I actually think that the discussion right now in the country about the growing divide, the growing wealth gap, is a huge issue for higher education. And this is why, right? So as you know, we're going to see a big demographic change in higher education in terms of the numbers of students coming into higher education and who they are in terms of race and ethnicity. But we're also going to see a big change in terms of family income. So there are, in this country today, 450 counties with more younger people than older people, right? More 4-year-olds than there are 60-year-olds and 50-year-olds. 450 counties. Of those 450 counties, only 100 of them have a median income at the U.S. level or above. So 350 counties are below the U.S. median income. These are the future students coming into the higher education system that is increasingly unable to serve them given the financial issues that they're facing. So when I was researching the book, I talked to a lot, as I said, I talked to a lot of families, and it was very interesting to me how our vision of higher education, how our definition of higher education is largely formed by popular culture in this country. And everybody talked to me about their favorite movies or their favorite TV shows that to them represented what American higher education is about. And it's interesting, the one down there on the lower left, I don't know how many of you saw Monsters University, but when the writers of Monsters University had to figure out what a college campus looks like, because they had to draw one, they went to Harvard, they went to MIT, and they went to Berkeley. Right? To them, that is what college is about in the US. And in the book, I call this the Hollywood version of American higher education, because in reality, only 2 out of 10 Americans, 2 out of 10 undergraduates go to a residential campus full-time and graduate in 4 years. 2 out of 10. So this vision of American higher education that we have, again, that's I think largely formed by popular culture, is really not representative of what most people are experiencing, whether they're going to school part-time, whether they're not going to a residential campus, or whether they're not having that traditional 4-year undergraduate experience. Indeed, A third of students now, a third, transfer at least once before earning a bachelor's degree. 1/3 transfer at least once before a bachelor's degree. 4 out of 5 report to researchers they're drifting through college, right? They're not quite sure why they're there, except somebody kind of told them to be there. And for the most part, I think that's because in the US, when we graduate from high school at the age of 18, we have very few choices, right? We could go into the military, and that's a declining option for many students. We could go and get a job, and not a very good one, with a high school diploma. We could live at home, and most parents don't want that to happen. And so we ship a lot of students off to college who are not quite ready. It's why I'm very interested in a lot of experiments happening right now around a gap year, or around, as many people are calling, a launch year, where you have a bridge between high school and college for those students who are not quite ready to go to college 3 months after high school graduation. Because what ends up happening is many end up in this group, right? 400,000 students drop out of college every year. 400,000 students, right? We have more people in this country with some college credit than we have people with college degrees. Some college credit than we have people with college degrees. And even for those students who make it to the other end, we get to this time of year, right, when they're all looking for jobs, and this is the data for last year's class, right, where nearly half of them now are underemployed, meaning they're in jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree, even though they have a bachelor's degree, and of course coming out around $30,000 in debt. And what I'm finding now, and I'm beginning work on or actually finishing work on another book, is that there is a disconnect between what colleges and universities are producing and what employers and the economy and society at large need, right? And so I'm hearing this over and over again, and this is what, if you see surveys of employers, this is what they keep saying over and over again are the top skills they need and are not necessarily getting in today's college graduates. And I think it's largely because we have a bachelor's degree that is not quite working for the 21st century. I tend to call it the overworked bachelor's degree because we have so many expectations of it that we have loaded it on. We have loaded on to the bachelor's degree so many requirements, right? So think about it. 40 years ago, when fewer people needed a bachelor's degree to succeed, at least economically, in this country, right? We used to go to college to get a broad education. And then we would graduate and go into the workforce and go into a job that usually would train us in a specific discipline, and that's probably a job or at least a company we would stay with probably for the rest of our lives. Or we would go to graduate or professional school to learn a specific skill or be trained in a specific discipline. Now we expect those two things to happen in tandem, right? Which is why on so many campuses we see so many debates and so much tension between the practical arts and the liberal arts, because we want both of those things to happen. And oh, by the way, we need all these other things to happen at the same time, right? We now have 80% of colleges and universities offering remedial classes, right? Because students are not quite ready for college coming out of high school. We expect experiential learning to happen, and rightly so, right? So undergraduate research, internships, study abroad. And increasingly, we want students, and pressure from both Washington and the states, we want students to graduate in 4 years, right? So we want all of this to happen in 4 years. And so what ends up happening is that we graduate students and everyone's kind of unhappy with the result, right? The faculty and the administration, the employers, the students, everybody's unhappy with what is coming out of this system. And we now, I think, need to rethink what we want out of the transition from college to the workforce. So this is the traditional model that for generations, at least since post-World War II, we have grown up with, right? So my father went through this, right? So he went to undergraduate, he got his graduate degree, and then he was a teacher for 33 years, same job, right? Education, full-time employment. After 33 years, he retired and moved into retirement. This is a new model that was proposed last year by Tony Carnevale, who's an economist at Georgetown University, and he was looking through 4 decades of labor statistics. And he started to see some interesting trends, particularly since the 1980s. And what he found was that actually when we graduated from college, students weren't moving directly into careers. They were moving into what he called a learning and earning phase, right? Where they would kind of shuttle between jobs, whether they were part-time or full-time jobs, further education, right? They were continuing to invest in their human capital by going back to graduate school or getting certificates or other short-term training. They would eventually, and by the way, they were also doing some occupational shopping because they weren't quite sure exactly what they wanted to do. Then they would eventually move into a full-time job, but by the way, that education would not stop, right? Because the amount of knowledge was constantly growing and they had to continue to get education and then eventually transition to retirement and then eventually retire. And what he found, how many of you in this room have kids in their 20s or are in your 20s? Okay. So what he found was that the average age of financial independence for today's college graduates is 30. 30. Back in 1982, it was 26. And so since the early 1980s, it has moved from this mid-20s age period to this late 20s age period, or actually age 30, because of what he called this decade of learning and earning. Yet, we still think of college as this one physical place you go to one time in your life and usually graduate at the age of 22, having it all figured out, right? And yet, there is this period, which I think has tremendous consequences for colleges and universities, which I'll talk about in a minute, which has tremendous consequences for colleges and universities as they kind of rethink that period of the 20s, particularly for their recent college graduates. So I started to think about writing College Unbound when my second daughter was born. So I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old at home. And when we had our second child, I started to think of these numbers, right? What would it cost us to send our kids to college at by the middle of next decade? And so if one of my daughters went to one of the most expensive private colleges, tuition alone, by the way, at today's rates would cost about $237,000 for 4 years, sticker price for 4 years of college. Even if she went to a public college, we're still talking about $100,000 in terms of 4 years of tuition. Who knows how they would live? But I started to be a little worried about this, which is I think what most new parents particularly are worried about. But I also started to wonder how different their lives would be by the time they were ready for college at the middle of next decade. For one, a third of children born today might live to see their 100th birthday, right? A third. But yet we still think, as I said earlier, of college as this place you go to 3 months after graduation, you spend 4 years there and then you're done and you move on, right? It's really a relic of a much earlier era where we lived much shorter lives and mostly had one career, and usually for one employer. And now my kids are going to move through many different careers and many different jobs. But what's the second question we ask of students when we find out they're going to college, right? The first question is, where are you going? And what's the second question? What's your major, right? What's your major going to be? We ask them at the age of 18 to pick a major for the rest of their lives. And then we wonder why so many students switch majors that first year or end up in careers that have nothing to do with their majors, right? But we're so focused on kind of picking that career at the age of 18 when they really have no idea what they want to do and when careers and jobs are changing so much. So it's all of these trends put together, right? These societal trends, these demographic trends, and largely these financial trends that I think are going to pressure higher education to change in the future. And where I see a future that is much more unbound. And this is the central thesis of College Unbound, one where the student is at the center and that education is largely driven by his or her choices, and most important, his or her choices throughout their lifetime. Where college and universities, where education and higher education in particular becomes a platform for lifelong learning, where you learn, unlearn, and relearn throughout your life, rather than a box you kind of enter at one point in your life, usually early on, and then exit 4 years later. This, to me, is the key for the future survival of most colleges and universities, is to kind of think outside of that box of a 4-year education for 18 to 22-year-olds, and to really rethink the idea of lifelong education. So what might something like this look like, right? So I'm always asked, usually by lawmakers or trustees, well, just give us the answer, right? So should we just go online? Is that the answer? What's the one thing we should do? The thing is that this is going to be a much more personalized experience in the future. There will be many different pathways for students to follow through higher education. Now, some of them will be very personalized, and students will be able to pick and choose. But we know that many 18-year-olds, they can't even pick a major or can't pick a school. So how can we expect them to kind of navigate their own pathway through higher education? And so I see many institutions surviving and thriving. The institutions that I see surviving and thriving are those that are able to map out these pathways for students, which I see as combining a lot of different ideas that are being talked about today, right? Whether it's this idea of adaptive or competency-based education, which measures students based on what they know rather than how much time they spend in a seat, experiential learning, online and hybrid and face-to-face courses, many more internships and apprenticeships. So they're getting much more professional education and maybe mixing and matching those. So there would be a lot more low residency options where students can spend much more time out in the workforce than they spend on campus. And again, I think this is where technology can play a large role. But some of these students will be able to navigate this system on their own, but I see many institutions having, instead of this one-size-fits-all experience that we largely deliver today. And if you remember those different segments of students that I showed you earlier who have many different motivations for why they're going to college, those institutions that I think are really going to survive and thrive in the future are those that lay out these various pathways. Now, students are already carving out these pathways, right? We tend to call them non-traditional, and if you read College Unbound, I talked to many of these students and told their stories, and I briefly want to repeat a couple of them here because I think they're critical to understanding how students think about the experience today. The first is, this is Jose James, who I met at Valencia College in Florida, who completed 3 degrees, completed 3 degrees, but transferred multiple times between institutions, largely because that's encouraged in Florida. He started at Valencia College, went to the University of Central Florida, eventually ended up at the University of Florida, and got both his associate's degree, his bachelor's degree, and his master's degree in that time, right? So swirling students have been around for a long time, right? These ideas, I told you earlier, a third of students now transfer at least once before they earn a bachelor's degree, right? This idea of a swirling student was coined way back in the 1970s, but the idea then, and I think the belief largely in higher education now, is that students who swirl, we're always thought of, well, they can't quite get it together academically or financially, right? Which is why they move through institutions so much. And what we're finding now is that students are actually designing these pathways right from the beginning, right? So this comes from Sallie Mae's annual survey of how Americans pay for college, right? Nearly a quarter of students now at community colleges come from families making over $100,000 a year. Before the 2008 recession, that was 5%, right? So just since then, families who have some of the financial wherewithal and are probably college educated are now seeing community colleges as a pathway to a 4-year degree and are designing that and as a way for their students to swirl. This is Jennifer Black, who I met at the University of Central Florida, where she was able to take a quarter of her classes in online or hybrid format, right? This idea of mixing and matching courses, right? So when I travel to campuses and meet folks on campuses, I'm sometimes introduced to the person who's in charge of online education, the person who's in charge of residential education, and then there's always a third person who's in charge of hybrid education, right? Never shall the three meet, right? right? We think in silos, right? Higher education has always been blamed. You know, departments don't talk to departments, schools don't talk to schools. So when we build this new online world, we have to replicate those silos in the same way, even though students, by the way, don't think in that way at all, right? They're able to easily move and seamlessly move between courses and mix and match those, which allowed somebody like Jennifer, who had to work and do internships, to graduate in 4 years, right? By having that flexibility to take her courses in either online or hybrid format. And then there finally is Cheryl Chu, who I met near my hometown of Washington, D.C., and she completed her bachelor's degree in 2.5 years at Western Governors University under their competency-based degree program, where her shortest class was 2 weeks, her longest class was 14 weeks, because it was based on how much she knew rather than how much time she spent in her seat, right? Completed her bachelor's degree in 2.5 years, paid $18,000 for it. 300 colleges and universities now offer some form of competency-based education, including last year, or now a year and a half ago, I guess, Northern Arizona, University of Wisconsin System, and Southern New Hampshire all started competency-based degree programs. Again, going back to those student segments I talked about earlier, this idea that students have different motivations for going to college. And then there is this new world, which had existed when I wrote College Unbound, but in many ways has really grown up in the last couple of years, of these new providers of education. So tonight, after I leave here, I'm heading out to Phoenix, where there is 2,000 people gathering, a mixture of educational entrepreneurs and investors, because last year $175 million was invested in education companies, and many of them are on this list, right? The Coursera and the edX's of the world, right? The big MOOC providers who I know you're all familiar with, lynda.com and iTunes U, all of whom offer skill-based courses. I want to talk about one in particular on here, and it's General Assembly. How many of you have heard of General Assembly? Okay, that's actually more. Okay, 3 hands, 4 hands. Usually I get no hands. General Assembly has been around for about 4 years now, started by a trio of Wharton graduates. They've served 100,000 students in the last 3 years. They're in 9 locations around the world, 8 in the US, 1 overseas. And they offer courses in everything from project management to design thinking to computer coding, which is their most popular. And these courses last anywhere from a couple of hours to 11 weeks, which is their computer coding class. I was very fascinated when they moved to Washington, D.C. about a year and a half ago. I went down there to sit in on some of their classes, and I noticed a couple of things. Very, very young group of people, by the way. So their average age of their student is 25. 99% of them have a bachelor's degree. 25, 99% have a bachelor's degree. They're all going back to General Assembly after their bachelor's degree to get a specific skill. Most of them said, if my college or university offered this, I'd go back there, right? Instead, they're going to a place that very few people have heard of because it's providing a specific skill. And by the way, many of them are getting jobs. I talked about General Assembly at another talk a couple of months ago, and a mother came up to me afterwards and said, my son graduated with a math major from Wesleyan, couldn't get a job in New York, went to General Assembly, took their 11-week coding class, and a week after that, he got a job. And I kind of wish that Wesleyan was able to provide both the great undergraduate liberal arts experience it did, plus give them, by the way, some sort of skill to get a job. And by the way, some people are now thinking of this. So this is Stanford 2025. So 2 years ago, Stanford has this world-renowned design school, as many of you know, and they decided to take a design challenge around undergraduate education at Stanford and what it would look like in the year 2025. Last July, the group came out, which was composed of undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty from Stanford. They came out with what they called were 4 provocations about what they think higher education should look like at Stanford in the year 2025. And so if you want to see all 4, I encourage you to go. They have a great website that lays all these out. I want to talk about one here, and that's what they called the open loop university. The idea in 2025, if Stanford adopts this, and I doubt they will, but if they do, is that you would apply to admissions at Stanford, and instead of getting access to 4 years of education, you would get access to 6 years of education that you can use any time throughout your life, right? It goes back to that platform for lifelong learning. And so you could come into Stanford and you could take the usual 4-year experience and get out, right? And still have 2 years that you can use in your 30s or your 40s, right? Or you could come in and after 2 years you could go work for that Silicon Valley startup, and then when it fails a couple of years later you could come back, right? And you could do another 2 years. But the idea here is that students are able to loop in and loop out at any time throughout their lifetime. And to Stanford, it also increases the value of their undergraduate experience. Now, I get a lot of questions, when I talk about this, I get a lot of questions, well, how are they going to pay for it and all this other stuff. You know, the designers never thought about all that stuff, right? But the concept is absolutely incredible in my mind, and I hope that somebody actually does it. So what impact does all of this have for your institution? So when I was writing my book, I came across this quote from one of the most hated companies in America, and that's Amazon, who has really kind of changed, as you know, the publishing process around the world. But if you think about all those companies I put up earlier and all the sectors they're in, right? You know, publishing and music, one of the things that you probably noted about them is that the distance between the producer and the consumer really changed over the last 20 years, right? We have basically eliminated the middleman in all of those cases. And so what if we turned this on its head and thought about this in terms of higher education, right? What if the distance between the producer, the teacher, the professor, and the student, and we eliminate it, what happens? What are the risks and opportunities for that institution, the university, that stands in the middle between those two? We're already seeing this, of course, in the MOOC world, right? Where now the professors, and I know there's some in this room that teach MOOCs, right, can reach the student directly without going through the institution. But even those institutions that are not part of the MOOC mania now are able to benefit from this. So this is MR University, which stands for Marginal Revolution University. So Tyler Cowen is an economics professor at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. He writes a very popular blog, if you're kind of into behavioral economics, called Marginal Revolution. And a couple of years ago, he decided, well, George Mason is not joining either Coursera or edX, so I'm going to get a $5 iPad app. I'm going to go home, and I'm going to record my lectures on my own. And the next day, I'm going to come in, and I'm going to put all of my lectures online, and I'm going to create my own university. And exactly what he did. Still teaches at George Mason. But he has reached, in the course of less than a year that this has been up, more people than he has his entire career teaching at George Mason University. It's great for him because he reaches a much wider audience. It's great for people like me who have an interest in economics. And now, by the way, on a Saturday night, I have 2 young kids, so this is what I do on a Saturday night. On a Saturday night, I could sign up for a course and within minutes be taking it, right? And by the way, I could kind of dabble in it, come in, come out, do what I want, read what I want, watch the lectures I want on my own schedule, right? Years ago, I would have to look for a course, probably at the local college, a local community college. I'd have to register, I'd have to apply or register for it. I'd have to wait weeks for it to start. I would have to follow their schedule. And now, because of the era of this free agent professor, which, by the way, I think you're going to see a lot more of these, right? A lot less tethered to the institution. I can now find some garbage out there. There's a lot of bad stuff out there as well, but some very good courses from professors around the world. So what does this mean for the residential campus, right? So this is a quote from A.G. Lafley, who's the CEO of Procter & Gamble. And when they bought Gillette back in the 1990s, he said, you know what, we're in the commodity business, right? We produce things we use every day in our lives, you know, Tide and Crest and all these other things. And what he saw happening is what I think all of you see happening in higher education. People were producing what P&G produced around the world at a much lower price point, and people were starting to buy it. And he said to his company, you have to figure out what we produce that's a commodity, what we produce that's truly innovative. And what's interesting when I speak a lot to boards of trustees or senior leadership groups, and I always ask this question. And everybody says, oh, we could figure that out, right? And you go around the room, and there's no agreement at an institution about what is truly different about what they're doing. Because higher education is very good about adding things, but very bad about taking anything away and deciding, you know what we're doing was great 20 years ago, but now that's a commodity, and everyone else is producing it. So what are more innovative things happening around residential education? None of this, by the way, none of this is really that much of a secret. I think all of you kind of know the benefits of residential education. But when I was interviewing people for the book, and if they went to a traditional college or university, I asked them, well, what's the biggest benefit, right, of that residential education? And I put them into 4 buckets, all of which George Q and others at Indiana University who have been talking about high-impact practices for the last decade have talked about for years. So that's why it's not really a secret. But it's amazing how your anecdotal research really does back up what the experts think. And, of course, number 1 is faculty as mentors, right, and full-time faculty in particular, right? And if you saw the results of the Purdue Gallup Index last year, right, so Purdue worked with Gallup, and Gallup interviews people around the world every night as part of their surveys. And they always ask people, you know, what are the benefits of a good life? And then they track back to figure out what happened, right? And one of the things they found was that students who identified a mentor in college who encouraged them to follow their dreams and help them get there are twice as likely to be engaged in their job and twice as likely to be living kind of a satisfying life because of faculty as mentors. Undergraduate research, I'm hearing this a lot from the employers I'm talking to now. They don't talk about it necessarily in terms of undergraduate research, but they talk about the ideas of working in groups, of figuring out problems where you don't necessarily know the solution in advance, right? You don't know the answer in advance, and of course learning how to fail as part of that, right? Hearing this a lot from employers, that today's young graduates do not know how to fail, right? Because what have we done? And I'm very critical of this in the book. We've added cadres of advisors and other people on campuses who have basically hold the hands of students through everything from advising to other types of services, and they don't necessarily know how to take risks, and they don't necessarily know how to fail. And then finally, the cross-cultural experience. All of these things, by the way, very hard to find online. And all the benefits of a residential experience. And this, by the way, is not just study abroad, but it's the idea of an American college campus in particular as kind of the stew of the world, where people from various different backgrounds and perspectives come together, because online we tend to connect with people like us. So I want to end kind of where I started, and this is on the value question of American higher education. So this question has been asked of the American public, of college presidents, and finally of faculty in various surveys by Time Magazine, by the Carnegie Foundation, by the Chronicle. And it asked them to rate the job that colleges are doing for the money spent. So 40% of the public said it was good or excellent, 40%. So that means 60% fair or poor think the value for the money spent. So they didn't ask them about money, but the value for the money spent. College presidents, they think we're doing a terrific job, right? 76%, right? The value that my student, and they asked them about their own institution, right? 76%. So about a year and a half ago, I asked the Chronicle, we were surveying 3,000 full-time faculty members at colleges and universities across the country, and I asked them to put this question on the survey, because I'm very interested in what faculty would think. I thought the faculty number would be actually close to the president's, and it was actually closer to the public, actually lower than the public, 31%. Now, much smaller survey sample than these other two groups, but we did a bunch of follow-up interviews, and one of the things we found was that faculty members increasingly thought that the lack of rigor on campuses, particularly in their courses, were actually declining the value of the residential experience and of residential education in general, and that students were not getting as much value for their education. And to me, measuring the outcomes of higher education is going to be the critical point, is really what's going to define higher education over the next 10 10 or 20 years, right? So these are, I don't know how many of you have seen these, but these are the LinkedIn has aggregated all the data they have on its members from around the world, right? They have 300 million members around the world, and they know everything about what you do if you're on LinkedIn, right? And most of the time, people are going to update their LinkedIn page with their new job before they call, if they ever call, their alma mater, right? So they actually know more about what your graduates are doing than you probably know in many cases. And so they have, and these pages now were developed about a year and a half ago to 2 years. I was just out at LinkedIn about 2 weeks ago because I'm working on a piece for the New York Times about how they see the future of the college rankings. And this is where I want to end today, right? They see a very different future than the rankings by US News and World Report and other rankings that are out there, right? Which are all based on inputs, right? Remember where we started this conversation, right? How the US News and World Report rankings have changed over the last 20 years, all based on inputs, all based on spending, the students you bring in the door, which really drove this prestige race in higher education. They believe it's going to be based on outputs, where they're able to essentially reverse engineer any career out there and figure out how the person got to where they are today. And starting last year and just a couple weeks ago, they put out rankings for both undergraduate and graduate programs, right? And so they can find out, if you want to be the chief marketing officer at a Fortune 500 company, we could tell you the types of jobs, the types of majors, and the types of institutions that got them there. Now, in some part of the world, this scares me, but in some part of the world, it's actually pretty exciting for a lot of institutions who haven't been able to play that rankings game by spending more money to bring in better students and better faculty, but have actually had really good outcomes, right? And their students have actually gone on to do great things, and they've never really gotten credit for it. And now they might. To me, higher education is a lot more than getting that good job, right? It's about, so to me, the next 10 years is going to be about defining value in higher education. And I think it's really going to be up to institutions to figure out, what do we stand for? What do we want to give our graduates? And then to put numbers around it, right? To figure out how well you're doing on all those fronts. Because if you don't do it, LinkedIn is going to do it. The Obama administration is going to do it. Or some magazine is going to do it. So how do you compete in this new world? Well, as I said, proving value, I think, is going to become the defining measure in higher education over the next 10 years. The idea of figuring out problems to solve instead of majors, right? So if you go to the Stanford 2025 site, you're going to see that one of the provocations they came up with was this idea of passions, which I think is kind of goofy, but passions instead of majors, right? More interdisciplinary majors than we have now. How do we certify the skills and the experiences we claim to be given students, and how do we do that in much more visual ways, right? We think in very visual ways, as we were talking earlier. And how do we certify that? So if students are going to be moving around a lot more, if they're going to be swirling around a lot more through higher education, and they're going to have experiences on campus and off campus, somebody at the end of the day has to certify them as worthy of that bachelor's degree, even if they haven't received all of those experiences at a place like at Vanderbilt. Finally, or almost finally, University for Life, this idea of the open loop university. How can we create this in American higher education? And then finally, I don't think most institutions can do any of this themselves, right? They have to form much deeper academic alliances with other institutions that are like themselves or in similar areas. So almost every decade in American higher education, somebody has predicted the demise of colleges and universities as we know it. This was a cover story in Newsweek back in 1976 when it predicted in the next 10 years, hundreds of colleges and universities would go out of business. Does that sound familiar? Back in 1976, hundreds of colleges. We actually have more colleges and universities today than we did in 1976, and of course Newsweek magazine is out of business. But one of the things that I found in my research for the last two books is that we tend to predict change is going to come very quickly when it actually takes much longer. But we tend to underestimate this. We tend to underestimate the depth of change. So we tend to overestimate the speed of change, but we tend to underestimate the depth of change. Just remember back in the late 1990s when I was sitting in rooms like this and hearing people talk about the future of journalism and how we would be reading newspapers on the internet someday on our desktop computers. Never did we predict that we would be reading newspapers on devices as small as this by the year 2015. I thank you for your time today, and I think I have a few minutes for a couple of quick questions. Thank you very much.
Questions for Selingo?
I grew up in a completely different system, so I grew up in Europe.
Yep.
You talk about these bounds. I mean, so their colleges are even more bound than here. So when you choose your major, not only your major, but your professional school at 18, as soon as you get out of high school. Are those models there, do you think? I mean, what's going to happen?
Well, I think most of them are, right? So many of the models around the world, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the Middle East, or whether it's the emerging models in China or India, are thinking of very different systems than we've had historically, either in the US or in Europe. So I think they're going to see many of the same changes that we're seeing. Now, what's interesting, for example, in China, is that they're actually trying to replicate our liberal arts colleges in some ways, right? So while we're moving away from the liberal arts because we don't think there's much practicality to it, they're actually moving toward that as they develop their undergraduate curriculum. So I think all of these models are under pressure. Here's the thing that gives me a lot of hope, though. I think that the enterprise of higher education is stronger than ever, right? There are more people around the world that are demanding a higher education than at any point really in human history. So to me, that's a great market to be in, right? As a university, I think it's the industry that is serving that demand that is in trouble, whether it's in the US, in Europe, and in other places. Yes?
So I have a question, and this is continuing the discussion we had at lunch. I think we're proposing many different alternate models of education. But one thing that we haven't figured out is how do we take our traditional models of assessing or evaluating students and apply it in these new models. So we seem to be stuck to our traditional models of assessment.
Right, which we think work, right? So when I talk about competency-based education to faculty members, they don't believe it, right? They don't believe that. How can you not be in a classroom for 14 or 15 or 16 weeks, right? How can you learn something? How do we really know you know something in 2 weeks? And I say, how do you know something in 15 weeks, right? So I'm not quite sure that the current models of assessment, which we tend to trust, are necessarily any better than what is emerging, right? No, we haven't fully developed them. But I think that part of the problem here is that there's now this pushback against what is becoming a very expensive system, and that alternative models are going to have to be developed. So back in 2013, of the 2013 high school graduating class, only 62% of that class enrolled in college the following fall, which was the smallest share in about 10 years, right? So following fall. So these are students who normally would have gone right on to college from high school, decided not to for a reason. Now, I'm not part of this crowd about don't go to college, which is a popular refrain among particularly people in Silicon Valley, right? To find, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs didn't graduate from college, neither do you. We all need some sort of post-secondary education. And so if we don't figure this out, my fear is that people, especially first-generation students and others who, again, going back to those demographic trends I was talking about earlier, are just going to say, I'm not going to go at all. And then I think we're in bigger trouble than we are right now. Yes?
So let me tell you something that I worry about, and tell me if I shouldn't worry about this or you think this is a problem. I foresee that there's going to be this bifurcation in society where the people that have wealth and means will continue to send people to the residential college experience where they'll get all this great social and cultural capital, and they will continue to kind of develop this intergenerational wealth transfer, right? That will end up making the problem worse. And everyone that can't afford cheap online education version that might teach them some content, but really is lacking in all of the other things like the undergraduate research education, cross-cultural experience, and things that you identify. Do you think I should worry?
Yes, you should worry. But the problem is, here's the issue. It's already happening. It's already happened, right? So, right, it's been happening, right? So if you come from a family making over $90,000, you have a 1 in 3 chance of having a bachelor's degree by the time you're 26. You come from a family under $30,000, you have a 1 in 18 chance of having a bachelor's degree by the time you're 26. We already have this bifurcated system already, right? I mean, just look at the enrollments at any of the elite universities. The number of Pell Grant students at any of these universities. We already have that bifurcated system. So what I think we want to try to figure out is, can we, through the injection, not the replacement of that residential experience, but through the injections of technology, reduce cost enough that we're able to offer, many of the positives, the positive outcomes of residential education to a larger student body than we have out there now. That I think is what's at stake right now. It could go one of two directions. It could go the direction, which I think is going now, the direction you talk about. I find it fascinating. As I said, I'm going out to this kind of investors ed tech conference in Phoenix. There'll be 2,000 people there. Probably 85% of whom went to the most elite colleges and universities in this country, all of whom are promoting alternatives that they wouldn't go to themselves or that they wouldn't send their kids to. Right? I'm very honest. Somebody always asks me, like, well, where would you send your kids? Well, first of all, my kids are 5 and 3, so I'm protected by answering that question by saying I have no idea because they're so far away. But, who knows what's going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years. But I do worry about that, but it's already happening. And so we have to figure out a way to stop that. Yes?
So one of the purposes I see for sending a young person to residential college is, if you will, a time of incubation,
right?
A maturation.
The coming of age.
It's coming of age, but it's a transition. It's that safe little bubble we think of, and yet I'm terrified about my daughters going to college. I know it's the most dangerous time of their lives.
Right.
How do we provide that maturing environment in a non-residential experience?
Well, first of all, I think we've had other maturing environments that weren't the residential experience of college, right? Think of the military, right? Right. Less of an option, right? But there are other ways. There's an effort now by General McChrystal, the Franklin Project, which is this idea of national service, right? So I think that there are other ways of providing I don't think it necessarily has to be residential, but I think there are other ways of providing that maturation experience to 18 and 19-year-olds that don't include essentially warehousing some of them, which is what I think we do with some of them now at residential colleges and universities, put many of them in debt, and at the end of the day, a lot of them do not actually get a degree out of it. If we delayed that for a segment of the population that's not quite ready, could we actually have better outcomes in the long run? I think so. Right? There's this effort. So there's a lot of small, part of the problem here is this is a big problem, right? So, 150,000 people apply for AmeriCorps every year for about 75,000 spots, right? So we have this huge problem. We have a need for more opportunity for students who are not ready to go to college at 18. And so what ends up happening is many of them go because there are no other options. So there's an effort now in Baltimore called Bridge EDU, which is a nonprofit which is starting this idea of a gap year for all, right? Where they get where they get work experience, where they get academic experience, and where they're able to do some career exploration, right? But again, all of these programs out there, some of which I'm now profiling, serve a couple hundred students, right? This is an order of magnitude of tens of thousands every year, and we need to create opportunities for those students as well. I think we have time for one more question. Yes?
So you talked about the traditional residential college or the alternate to competency-based education system.
Which, by the way, all have residential components to them. It's really interesting to me, Minerva, I'm sorry, go ahead and then I'll answer. Yeah, well, because, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with Minerva. Okay, so I didn't talk about Minerva, but I visited them a couple weeks ago. I did a piece for the Chronicle. So this is this venture capital-backed elite college, online college, $75 million. Larry Summers and a couple of other prominent folks were backing it. They had a chance to reset higher education, right? To create a whole new college from scratch. And they still have a residential component to it, right? So all the courses are online, but they still live together in one single city because of that residential experience. So I think you have there is a possibility to blend both. It doesn't necessarily have to look like this.
But I have an 18-year-old who's
Yep.
applying to college, right? And what she is looking for is the traditional college experience. I don't think she's going to consider anything else, won't even consider anything else. But that was to her, that's what's college. And there's a lot of
That's
people
cultural.
that she grew
Yep.
up in Vanderbilt,
Yep.
that's what she knows.
Yep.
That's another story. But when you look at what's out there and all the different colleges that we've visited, all of them do indeed follow high tuition and a lot of demand with or without a delivery of what they promise. But how do you present to this 18-year-old an option that's somewhere in the middle? You almost need an educational system that meets in the middle, that maintains lower cost, but still gives you the full experience of a university, which does include face-to-face interaction with faculty, that does include the research experience, that does include other experiences, life experiences, whatever you want to call it, and yet not have to pay $60,000 per year in tuition.
Well, it could. I mean, is it going to happen overnight? No.
But what is that model? How do you create that culture of getting universities to create another?
Well, first of all, I think many universities are going to be forced to create different models because either that or they're going to become the next Sweetbriar, right? They're not going to have much of a choice. I think this alliance idea has a lot of possibilities. So there's this thing called the University Innovation Alliance, which is 11 public universities which just came together. They're going to share kind of best practices between them. They serve about 400,000 students. I think that's a precursor to many more deeper academic alliances, which include things like course sharing or department sharing among colleges and universities that can never survive on their own. And once you do that, then you allow for a much more free flow of students, right? So it was interesting when Sweetbriar went out of business, one of the things the college's president mentioned was that because we are in such a remote location of Virginia, our students don't have great experiential learning opportunities, right? They can't easily intern in the afternoon and go to classes in the morning, right? Just imagine if we had these academic alliances, which could include, by the way, traditional colleges and universities, and could include things like General Assembly. It could include employers, where there's a much more free flow between institutions, employers, work experiences, research experiences, and things like that. It requires, though, a much different ecosystem than we have now. And it requires, I think, more of them so that students at the age of 18 could see these as alternative pathways. And the final piece, there's a lot of requirements here, the final piece are the employers. Because if employers don't trust the credential and they don't hire students from those places, they'll never survive. I mean, I'm kind of interested in what happens to Minerva. I don't think they really have a shot, right? Because they're going after they want to create an elite online university, which has never really been done, right? Everybody's gone after the bottom of the market, much easier to achieve, right? They're going after students who get rejected or even accepted by the Vanderbilts of the world. Well, people who get rejected or even accepted and decide not to come here, they're going to go to probably another elite university. They're probably not going to take a chance on something most people have never even heard of, particularly employers. So I think they have so that's the battle. We're battling against the culture of kind of this college-going culture we have in the U.S., particularly of higher income families. Well, thank you very much. If you're interested, I have free copies of Mukyu, which was my second book, only came out in e-books. So I actually don't have print books. But if you're interested, I have cards for free downloads. So I have a bunch here, not enough for everybody. But if you're interested, come down and see me. Thank you.
And we have a reception outside, so please come out and eat and drink.
Yes.